The ship's alarms blared as the human gripped the controls, his heart pounding. The engine was failing, and the planet below was coming up fast. He had no choice but to brace for impact. The crash was brutal, tossing him around like a ragdoll. When he finally opened his eyes, the cockpit was filled with smoke, and the smell of burnt metal stung his nose. He stumbled out of the wreckage, coughing and clutching his side. The planet was unlike anything he had seen before. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the trees were tall and twisted, their leaves glowing faintly in the dim light. He had no idea where he was, but one thing was clear: he was alone. Or so he thought. A low growl echoed through the trees, sending a chill down his spine. He turned slowly, his hand reaching for the knife at his belt. The growl grew louder, and then he saw it, a massive creature, unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was wounded, its dark, shimmering scales torn and bleeding. But what caught his attention were its eyes. They were intelligent, filled with pain and fear. Before he could react, the creature collapsed, its body hitting the ground with a thud. The human hesitated, his instincts telling him to run. But something about the creature's eyes made him stay. He approached cautiously, his knife still in hand. "Please," the creature whispered, its voice weak but clear. "Help me." The human froze. The creature could speak. And it was asking for his help. The human knelt beside the wounded creature, his knife still gripped tightly in his hand. His mind raced. This was no ordinary animal, it could speak, and its voice carried a weight of authority, even in its weakened state. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. The creature's eyes flickered open, glowing faintly in the dim light of the alien forest. "I am the last hope of my people," it said, each word labored. "They call me the Queen of the Kryn." The human's eyes widened. A queen? Here, on this primitive world? He had so many questions, but there was no time. The sound of distant footsteps echoed through the trees, growing louder by the second. "They're coming," the queen whispered, her voice trembling. "My own kind, they want me dead." The human didn't hesitate. He slid his knife back into its sheath and crouched beside her. "Can you walk?" She shook her head weakly. "Not without help." He nodded, slipping his arm under her massive body. She was heavier than she looked, but he managed to lift her slightly, enough to drag her toward the cover of the trees. His muscles burned with the effort, but he pushed through, his mind focused on one thing: survival. They didn't get far before the footsteps grew louder. The human ducked behind a large rock, pulling the queen down with him. He peered over the edge, his heart pounding. In the distance, he saw them, tall, armored figures with weapons that glowed with an eerie light. They moved with precision, scanning the area like hunters tracking their prey. "Why are they after you?" the human whispered, turning back to the queen. She hesitated, her eyes filled with pain, not just from her wounds, but from something deeper. "I tried to change things," she said softly. "My people have been at war for generations. I wanted peace, but not everyone agreed. My own council betrayed me. They called me weak, a traitor to our ways. Now, they want to erase me and everything I stand for." The human listened, his initial fear giving way to something else: empathy. He had seen enough war and conflict in his own world to understand what she was saying. "You're not weak," he said firmly. "Trying to bring peace takes more courage than starting a war." The queen looked at him, her glowing eyes softening. "You are different from the others of your kind. Most would have left me to die." The human shrugged. "I'm not most people." The sound of the hunters grew closer, snapping them back to reality. The human glanced around, searching for a way out. The forest was dense, but he noticed a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "We need to move," he said, helping the queen to her feet. Can you hold on to me? She nodded, wrapping one of her massive arms around his shoulders. Together, they stumbled down the path, the queen's weight slowing them down but not stopping them. The human's mind raced as they moved. He didn't know how he was going to get them out of this, but one thing was clear, he couldn't leave her behind. As they disappeared into the shadows of the forest, the queen spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. Why are you helping me? The human thought for a moment before answering. Because it's the right thing to do. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper into its heart. The alien queen leaned heavily on the human, her breathing labored but steady. The human's muscles ached from the strain, but he pushed forward, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. The hunters were still out there, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they found their queen. Suddenly, the queen stopped, her head tilting as if listening to something. Wait, she whispered. The human froze, his senses on high alert. What is it? They're close, she said, her voice barely audible. I can feel them. Before he could respond, a low hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. The human's eyes darted around, searching for the source. Then he saw it, a small, glowing drone hovering above the trees, its lens scanning the area. Get down, he hissed, pulling the queen behind a thick tree trunk. The drone passed overhead, its light sweeping the ground where they had just been standing. The human held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, the drone moved on, disappearing into the distance. We can't stay here, the human said, helping the queen to her feet. They'll find us if we don't keep moving. The queen nodded, but her movements were slower now, her strength fading. There's a cave nearby, she said weakly. If we can reach it, we might be able to hide there. The human didn't ask how she knew about the cave. He simply nodded and adjusted his grip on her, urging her forward. The path was rough, filled with twisted roots and jagged rocks, but they pressed on, driven by the fear of what would happen if they were caught. As they walked, the human couldn't help but notice the strange beauty of the forest. The glowing leaves cast an eerie light on the ground, and the air was filled with the soft hum of unseen creatures. It was a world unlike anything he had ever experienced, but there was no time to appreciate it. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the cave. It was hidden behind a curtain of vines, its entrance barely visible in the dim light. The human helped the queen inside, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The cave was small but deep, with walls that seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive. We should be safe here for a while, the queen said, sinking to the ground. The human nodded, but his mind was already racing. We can't stay here forever, he said. We need a plan. The queen looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. You've done more than enough for me, she said. I don't expect you to risk your life any further. The human shook his head. I'm not leaving you. Not now. The queen studied him for a moment, as if trying to understand what drove him. You are different, she said finally. Most of your kind would have abandoned me by now. The human shrugged. Maybe I'm not like most of my kind. The queen smiled faintly, a gesture that seemed almost human. Then perhaps there is hope for your world after all. The human didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention to the cave's entrance, his mind already working on their next move. They couldn't stay here forever, and he knew the hunters would eventually find them. They needed a way off this planet, but with his ship destroyed and the queen's enemies closing in, the odds were stacked against them. As he sat there, listening to the distant hum of the drones, a thought occurred to him. You said your people are at war, he said, turning back to the queen. Is there anyone left who's still loyal to you? The queen hesitated, her eyes clouded with doubt. There may be a few, she said slowly. But they are scattered, afraid to speak out against the council. The human nodded, a plan beginning to form in his mind. Then we need to find them, he said. If we can rally your supporters, we might have a chance. The Queen looked at him, her expression a mix of hope and disbelief. You would do that for me? The human met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. I told you, he said. I'm not leaving you. The cave was quiet, save for the faint hum of the glowing walls and the Queen's labored breathing. The human sat near the entrance, his eyes fixed on the forest outside. The drones had passed by twice since they arrived, but so far, the cave remained hidden. Still, he knew it was only a matter of time before the hunters found them. The Queen stirred, her massive body shifting slightly. You should rest, she said, her voice weak but gentle. You've been awake for too long. The human shook his head. I'll rest when we're safe. The Queen studied him, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and concern. You've already done so much for me, she said. I don't know how to repay you. The human glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. You don't have to repay me. Just focus on getting stronger. We're going to need you if we're going to make it out of this. The Queen nodded, but her expression grew serious. There's something you should know, she said. The hunters, they won't stop until I'm dead. And they won't hesitate to kill anyone who stands in their way. The human met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. Then we'll just have to make sure they don't find us. Before the Queen could respond, a loud crash echoed through the forest, followed by the sound of voices. The human's heart skipped a beat. He crept to the cave's entrance and peered out, his eyes scanning the trees. In the distance, he saw movement, figures clad in dark armor, their weapons glowing ominously. They're here, he whispered, turning back to the Queen. The Queen's eyes widened with fear. You need to leave, she said urgently. Take the path behind the cave and run. Don't look back. The human shook his head. I'm not leaving you. You don't understand, the Queen said, her voice trembling. If they catch you with me, they'll kill you. I can't let that happen. The human knelt beside her, his expression firm. Listen to me, he said. I didn't come this far to abandon you now. We're in this together, and we're going to get out of it together. The Queen stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Why? She asked softly. Why are you doing this? The human thought for a moment before answering. Because it's the right thing to do, he said simply. Before the Queen could respond, the sound of footsteps grew louder. The hunters were closing in. The human stood, his mind racing. He knew they couldn't fight them head-on, not with the Queen injured and their numbers against them. But they couldn't stay here either. We need to move, he said, helping the Queen to her feet. She winced in pain but nodded, leaning heavily on him as they made their way deeper into the cave. The passage was narrow and winding, the walls glowing faintly as they moved. The human's heart pounded with every step, his senses on high alert. Suddenly, the cave shook, and a loud explosion echoed from the entrance. Dust and debris rained down around them as the hunters blasted their way in. They found us, the Queen cried, her voice filled with panic. The human's mind raced. They were trapped, with no way out. But then he noticed something, a faint light coming from a crack in the cave wall. He rushed to it, his hands feeling along the surface. There's a way out, he said, turning back to the Queen. But before they could move, a group of hunters appeared at the end of the passage, their weapons trained on them. The human stepped in front of the Queen, shielding her with his body. Stay behind me, he said, his voice steady. The hunters advanced, their leader stepping forward. Step aside, human, he said, his voice cold and mechanical. This does not concern you. The human didn't budge. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. The leader raised his weapon, its glow intensifying. so be it. The human braced himself, his heart pounding. He knew he couldn't win this fight, but he wasn't going to back down. Just as the hunter was about to fire, the queen let out a deafening roar, her body glowing with a blinding light. The hunters stumbled back, shielding their eyes. Now, the queen shouted, her voice filled with power. The human didn't hesitate. He grabbed the queen's arm and pulled her toward the crack in the wall, squeezing through just as the hunters recovered. They emerged on the other side, the forest stretching out before them. But the human's relief was short-lived. As they stumbled forward, a sharp pain shot through his side. He looked down to see a glowing wound, the result of a stray blast from the hunters. "You're hurt," the queen cried, her voice filled with anguish. The human gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep moving. "I'll be fine," he said, though his vision was already starting to blur. The queen's eyes filled with tears as she realized the extent of his sacrifice. "You're risking everything for me," she said softly. The human managed a weak smile. "Like I said, it's the right thing to do." The human's vision blurred as he stumbled forward, the pain in his side growing sharper with every step. The queen supported him as best she could, her massive frame trembling under the strain. The forest around them seemed to close in, the glowing leaves casting eerie shadows on the ground. "We need to find shelter," the queen said, her voice filled with urgency. "You're losing too much blood." The human nodded weakly, his strength fading fast. He could feel the warmth of his blood soaking through his clothes, but he forced himself to keep moving. They couldn't stop now, not with the hunters still on their trail. As they pressed on, the forest began to change. The twisted trees gave way to towering stone structures, their surfaces covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. The air grew cooler, and the ground beneath their feet became smooth and polished, as if worn down by centuries of use. "Where are we?" the human asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The queen's eyes widened as she took in their surroundings. This is the lost city of my ancestors," she said, her voice filled with awe. "I thought it was just a legend." The human didn't have the energy to respond. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to the ground, his vision darkening. The queen knelt beside him, her glowing eyes filled with panic. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You can't give up now." The human tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His body felt heavy, as if sinking into the ground. Just as his eyes began to close, a soft hum filled the air, growing louder by the second. The queen looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. Emerging from the shadows were figures, tall and slender, their skin shimmering like the walls of the cave. They moved with a grace that was almost otherworldly, their eyes glowing with the same light as the queen's. "Who are you?" the queen asked, her voice filled with both hope and caution. One of the figures stepped forward, their voice soft and melodic. "We are the keepers of the lost city," they said. "We have been waiting for you." The queen's breath caught in her throat. "Waiting for me?" The figure nodded. "You are the last of the Kryn queens, the one destined to unite our people. We have watched over you, waiting for the day you would return." The queen looked down at the human, her eyes filled with desperation. "Please," she said. "He's dying. You have to help him." The figure knelt beside the human, their glowing hands hovering over his wound. A soft light emanated from their fingertips, and the human's body began to relax as the pain slowly faded. "He will live," the figure said, their voice calm and reassuring. "But he needs rest." The queen let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. The figure nodded, then turned to the others. "Take them to the sanctuary," they said. "They will be safe there." The human felt himself being lifted, his body weightless as the figures carried him deeper into the city. The last thing he saw before drifting off was the queen's face, her glowing eyes filled with relief and determination. When the human awoke, he was lying on a soft bed of moss, the pain in his side completely gone. He sat up slowly, his eyes adjusting to the soft glow of the room. The walls were made of the same glowing stone as the city, and the air was filled with the faint hum of energy. The queen was sitting beside him, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You're awake," she said, her voice soft. The human nodded, his mind still foggy. "What happened?" "The keepers saved you," the queen said. "They've been watching over this city for generations, waiting for the right time to reveal themselves." The human looked around, taking in the strange beauty of the room. "And now that they've found you?" The queen's expression grew serious. "They believe I'm the one who can unite my people and end the war," she said. "But it won't be easy. The council will stop at nothing to maintain their power." The human nodded, his mind already working on a plan. "Then we'll just have to outsmart them," he said. The queen looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You've already done so much for me," she said. "I can't ask you to risk your life again." The human met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "You're not asking," he said. "I'm offering." The queen smiled faintly, a gesture that seemed almost human. "Then perhaps there is hope for us after all." The human and the queen spent the next few days in the sanctuary, recovering and planning their next move. The keepers of the lost city provided them with food, shelter, and information about the current state of the Kryn civilization. The more they learned, the more it became clear that the council's grip on power was stronger than ever. "The council has spread lies about me," the queen said one evening, her voice filled with frustration. "They've convinced my people that I'm a traitor, that I abandoned them for my own gain." The human listened, his mind racing. "We need to show them the truth," he said. "If we can prove that the council betrayed you, we might be able to turn the tide." The queen nodded, but her expression was uncertain. "It won't be easy. The council controls the media and the military. They'll do everything in their power to silence us." The human leaned forward, his eyes filled with determination. "Then we'll have to be smarter than them. We'll need allies, people who are willing to stand up to the council and fight for what's right." The queen thought for a moment, then nodded. "There are a few who might still be loyal to me," she said. "But they're scattered, afraid to speak out." "Then we'll find them," the human said. "And we'll give them a reason to fight." The next morning, they set out with the help of the keepers, who provided them with a map of the city and information about potential allies. The plan was risky, but it was their only chance. Their first stop was a small settlement on the outskirts of the city, where a former general of the Kryn army was rumored to be living in exile. The general had been a close ally of the queen's father, and the queen hoped he would be willing to join their cause. When they arrived, the settlement was eerily quiet. The streets were empty, and the buildings looked abandoned. The human's instincts told him something was wrong, but the queen insisted on pressing forward. "He's here," she said, her voice filled with hope. "I can feel it." They found the general in a small house at the edge of the settlement. He was older, his once proud frame now bent with age, but his eyes still burned with the fire of a warrior. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing his head as the queen entered. "I never thought I'd see you again." The queen smiled, her eyes filled with relief. "I need your help," she said. "The council has betrayed me, and I need allies to take back what's rightfully mine." The general listened intently, his expression unreadable. When the queen finished, he nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for this day," he said. "But we must be careful. The council has eyes everywhere." The human stepped forward, his voice firm. "We have a plan," he said. "But we'll need your help to make it work." The general studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Very well," he said. "I'll do what I can." For the next few hours, they worked out the details of their plan. The general agreed to rally his former troops and spread the word about the Queen's return. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance at gaining support. Just as they were about to leave, the general stopped them. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low. "The council has a spy in your ranks. Someone close to you." The Queen's eyes widened in shock. "Who?" The general hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. But be careful. Trust no one." The human's mind raced as they left the settlement. If there was a spy among them, their entire plan could be compromised. But before he could voice his concerns, loud explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The human turned just in time to see a group of hunters emerging from the shadows, their weapons trained on them. At the front of the group was the general, his expression cold and unfeeling. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But the council made me an offer I couldn't refuse." The Queen's eyes filled with anger and betrayal. "You traitor," she shouted. The human grabbed her arm, pulling her back as the hunters opened fire. They ran, dodging blasts and weaving through the narrow streets. The settlement was a maze, but the humans' instincts kept them one step ahead of their pursuers. Finally, they reached the edge of the settlement, where the forest began. The human glanced back, his heart pounding. The hunters were closing in, and they were running out of time. "We need to split up," he said, turning to the Queen. "It's the only way." The Queen shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "No. We stay together." The human hesitated, then nodded. "Then let's make sure they regret coming after us." The human and the Queen sprinted into the forest, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The hunters were close behind, their weapons lighting up the shadows with bursts of energy. The human's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out. They couldn't keep running forever, they needed a plan. "This way," the Queen shouted, veering off the path and into a dense thicket. The human followed without hesitation, trusting her instincts. The thicket was a tangle of glowing vines and twisted branches, but it provided cover from the hunters' line of sight. They crouched low, their bodies pressed against the ground as the hunters passed by, their voices harsh and urgent. "Spread out," one of them barked. "They can't have gone far." The human's heart pounded as he listened to their footsteps fading into the distance. He turned to the Queen, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get back to the city. It's the only place we'll be safe." The Queen nodded, her glowing eyes filled with determination. "But we can't go back the way we came. They'll be watching for us." The human thought for a moment, then remembered the map the keepers had given them. "There's another route," he said, pulling the map from his pocket. "It's longer, but it's less likely to be guarded." The Queen studied the map, her expression focused. "Then that's the way we'll go." They moved cautiously, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open areas. The forest was alive with strange sounds, chirps, hums, and the occasional rustle of movement. The human senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming at him to stay vigilant. As they neared the edge of the forest, the human noticed something strange. The ground was littered with broken branches and scorch marks, as if a battle had taken place here recently. He crouched down, examining the marks more closely. "What is it?" the Queen asked, her voice tense. The human frowned. "It looks like someone was here before us. And they didn't go quietly." Before the Queen could respond, a loud roar echoed through the trees, shaking the ground beneath them. The human's eyes widened as a massive creature emerged from the shadows, a beast unlike anything he had ever seen. It was covered in thick, armored scales, its eyes glowing with a fierce light. "Run!" the human shouted, grabbing the Queen's arm and pulling her back. But the creature was faster than it looked. It lunged at them, its massive claws slashing through the air. The human barely managed to dodge, his heart pounding as he scrambled to his feet. "We can't outrun it," the queen cried, her voice filled with panic. The human's mind raced. They couldn't fight the creature head-on, but they couldn't run either. Then he noticed something, a narrow crevice in the rocks nearby, just big enough for them to squeeze through. "This way," he shouted, pulling the queen toward the crevice. They barely made it inside as the creature slammed into the rocks, its roar shaking the ground. The human and the queen pressed themselves against the walls, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. "What now?" the queen whispered, her voice trembling. The human glanced around, his eyes landing on a cluster of glowing crystals embedded in the rock. He remembered the keepers mentioning something about the crystals, how they could be used to create powerful explosions if struck in the right way. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. Before the queen could protest, he crept back toward the entrance, his eyes fixed on the crystals. The creature was still outside, its massive body blocking the way. The human took a deep breath, then picked up a rock and hurled it at the crystals. The impact caused a chain reaction, the crystals glowing brighter and brighter until they exploded in a burst of light and energy. The creature roared in pain, its body thrown back by the force of the blast. The human stumbled back, his ears ringing from the explosion. He turned to the queen, his voice urgent. "Now's our chance. Let's go." They scrambled out of the crevice and ran, the creature's roars fading behind them. The path to the city was clear now, and they made their way as quickly as they could. When they finally reached the city, the keepers were waiting for them. "We felt the disturbance," one of them said, their voice filled with concern. "Are you hurt?" The human shook his head, his body trembling with exhaustion. "We're fine. But we need to prepare. The hunters are coming, and they won't stop until they have the queen." The keepers nodded, their expressions serious. "Then we will stand with you," they said. "This city has stood for centuries, and it will not fall now." The queen stepped forward, her eyes filled with determination. "This is our chance to end this," she said. "To show my people the truth and take back what's rightfully ours." The human nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Then let's make sure they regret ever coming after us." The city was alive with activity as the keepers prepared for the coming battle. The human and the queen stood at the center of it all, their presence a rallying point for those who had remained loyal. Word of the queen's return had spread quickly, and despite the council's efforts to suppress it, hope began to flicker in the hearts of the Kryn people. The human watched as the queen addressed a growing crowd, her voice strong and unwavering. "The council has lied to you," she said, her words echoing through the ancient streets. "They have betrayed our people, sowing division and fear to maintain their power. But today, we take a stand. Today, we fight for our future." The crowd erupted in cheers, their glowing eyes filled with newfound determination. The human felt a surge of pride as he watched the queen inspire her people. She was no longer the wounded, hunted figure he had found in the forest, she was a leader, ready to reclaim her throne. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. A loud boom echoed through the city, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The human turned to see a massive ship descending from the sky, its dark hull bristling with weapons. The council had arrived. "They're here," the queen said, her voice calm but filled with resolve. "This is it." The human nodded, his mind racing. "We need to hold them off long enough for the keepers to activate the city's defenses." The queen placed a hand on his shoulder, her glowing eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." The human smiled faintly. "We're not done yet." As the council's forces poured into the city, the human and the queen led the charge, their small but determined army fighting with everything they had. The battle was fierce, the air filled with the sounds of blaster fire and the cries of the wounded. The human fought with a ferocity he didn't know he had, his every move driven by the need to protect the queen and the people who had placed their trust in her. Despite their bravery, the council's forces were overwhelming. The human and the queen were forced to fall back, their numbers dwindling with every passing moment. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, a loud hum filled the air, and the city's ancient defenses sprang to life. The ground shook as massive energy shields rose from the ground, blocking the council's advance. The keepers had done their job. Now, the queen shouted, her voice filled with determination. Push them back. The human and the queen led the counterattack, their forces driving the council's troops into retreat. The tide of the battle had turned, and for the first time, victory seemed within reach. As the last of the council's forces fled, the city erupted in cheers. The queen stood at the center of it all, her glowing eyes filled with pride and relief. The human watched from a distance, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. But their victory was not yet complete. The council's leader, a tall, imposing figure clad in dark armor, emerged from the shadows, his weapon glowing with a menacing light. "You think you've won?" he sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "This city will fall, and you with it." The queen stepped forward, her expression calm but filled with resolve. "Your reign of terror ends here," she said. "I will not let you destroy my people." The council leader laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "We'll see about that." The human moved to stand beside the queen, his weapon at the ready. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. The queen nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. Together. The battle that followed was intense, the council leader's skill and power matched only by the queen's determination and the human's ingenuity. They fought as one, their movements perfectly synchronized. In the end, it was the queen who delivered the final blow, her weapon piercing the council leader's armor and ending his reign of terror once and for all. As the council leader fell, the city fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over everyone present. The queen turned to the human, her glowing eyes filled with emotion. "It's over," she said softly. The human nodded, his body trembling with exhaustion. "You did it." The queen shook her head. "We did it." The city was quiet now, the echoes of battle replaced by a sense of peace and relief. The queen stood at the heart of the ancient streets, her people gathered around her, their glowing eyes filled with hope and admiration. The human stood by her side, his presence a silent reminder of the bond that had brought them this far. The queen raised her hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Today, we have reclaimed our future," she said, her voice strong and clear. "But this victory is not mine alone. It belongs to all of us, to those who stood together, who fought for what was right, and who refused to let fear divide us." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison. The human watched as the queen's people celebrated, their joy and relief palpable. He felt a sense of pride, knowing he had played a part in this moment. As the celebrations continued, the queen turned to the human, her glowing eyes filled with gratitude. "You have given us more than I can ever repay," she said softly. "You showed us that even in the darkest times, there is hope. That even the most different beings can find common ground." The human smiled faintly. "I just did what I thought was right." The queen studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You are welcome to stay here," she said. "You have a place among us, if you wish it." The human hesitated, his mind racing. He had grown to care for the queen and her people, but he knew his place was not here. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally. "But I need to return to my own world. There's still so much I need to do." The queen nodded, her expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "Then I will not stop you," she said. "But know this, you will always have a home here, should you ever need it." The human felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The queen reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. You have taught us so much, she said. About courage, about sacrifice, and about the power of unity. I will carry those lessons with me, always. The human nodded, his eyes meeting hers. And I'll carry the memory of this place with me, he said. Of you, and your people. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow over the ancient stones, the human prepared to leave. The keepers had repaired his ship, and it was ready to take him home. The queen walked with him to the edge of the city, her presence a comforting reminder of all they had been through. Take this, she said, handing him a small, glowing crystal. It is a symbol of our bond. Wherever you go, know that you are not alone. The human took the crystal, its light warm in his hand. I'll never forget this, he said. The queen smiled, her glowing eyes filled with warmth. Nor will I. As the human boarded his ship and prepared for takeoff, he took one last look at the city and the queen standing at its edge. He felt a sense of peace, knowing he had made a difference, not just for her, but for an entire world. As the ship lifted off, the human leaned back in his seat, the crystal glowing softly in his hand. He thought about all he had learned, about courage, about sacrifice, and about the power of unity. He knew that no matter where his journey took him next, he would carry those lessons with him. And as the stars stretched out before him, the human felt a sense of hope. For he knew that even in the vastness of the universe, there was always a chance to make a difference, to bring light to the darkness, and to unite even the most different of beings.